Fabulous. So, thank you everybody for coming here this morning and for joining us. And a big thank you for Meredith for videoing in. Really do appreciate you being here. I might actually just hand over to Catherine to do the same before you begin.
Thank you. I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong. I can never quite remember it. So, essentially, welcome everybody. And I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people, the traditional custodians of the land on which this meeting is taking place, and to pay tribute and respect to the elders, both past and present and emerging, of the Bunurong, Gumbaynggirr and Yagal nations, which lie within our council boundaries. So, once again, welcome and have an informative day.
I'm sure we shall. Now, everybody who's actually joining us on
You might need to
Blue Jeans, can you please make sure that you've turned your microphone off, muted it completely, and if you have any questions for Meredith, if you could ask them via chat, and we'll pass them through. Thanks. And we're good.
Great. Should I get started?
Yes.
Great.
I can learn to understand you much better if I can get familiar with the way you talk.
Sorry,
I need your permission to help.
Coming up on the screen, I'm just going to get.
Let's see. Let me just find my screen. Here we go. Can you see that? Leaving. Oh, whoops. Hit the wrong button. Do you see that? Leaving our desks? Adventures in Library Embedment? Excellent. Okay. Always fun trying to share screens. Okay, well, good morning. I thought I would be doing this presentation from my office, but today we were snowed in and my work was canceled, so I am doing it from my 9-year-old's bedroom since I don't have a desk at home. Really happy to be with you all today. My name is Meredith Farkas. I am a faculty librarian at Portland Community College, where I am our SEC chair, which means that I'm kind of in charge of our curriculum work and our instructional assessment work. I'm also the president of the Association of College and Research Libraries in Oregon, and I'm a lecturer at San Jose State University, where I teach a course on library embedment, though it is, full disclosure, focused on academic libraries primarily, but I often have public library students in the course, so I have gotten to see a lot of interesting examples of embedment in the public library sector as well. All right, so I'm over here in Portland, Oregon. Before I came to Portland Community College, I was the head of instructional services at Portland State University. I was before that the head of instructional initiatives at Norwich University, which is a small, Portland State is a large urban research university. Norwich University is a small private university where half our students were distance learners. And before I became the head of instruction there, I was the distance learning librarian. So pretty much my entire career, I've been thinking about embedment and different ways that we can embed the library in our users' experience without expecting them necessarily to come to us. So I wanted to get started by sort of coming up with a working definition of embedded librarianship, and a little bit about its history and what I see as being the characteristics that describe it. So the term embedded librarian comes from that term embedded journalists during the Iraq War and the invasion of Afghanistan. There were lots of journalists embedded in military companies rather than just like interviewing people when they came back from battles and stuff. They were actually in the battles themselves. So the idea of getting out of your usual space. In 2005, I know this says 2008, but I think that's when it was published online. In 2005, this article, The Embedded Librarians, Strategic Campus Collaborations, came out by Barbara Dewey. And this was the first article that ever came up with the term embedded librarian. And she talked about it in the context of academic libraries, but it was really the idea that we can't just rely on people coming to us anymore in our current information environment, and that embedding librarians and library resources in as many places and initiatives on campus as possible will make us much more valuable to the institution. We can no longer rest on our laurels and just say, oh, well, the library is the heart of the campus. That's always the term that I hear, but we can't take that for granted anymore. So I really liked this quote from an article called Community Reference in American Libraries Magazine. And at the end of my slides, there's a whole bibliography, and I'll share the link with everyone. There's a whole bibliography of resources that I think are worth looking at, mostly focused on public libraries. I really love this quote. Libraries are constantly evolving to adapt to the needs and desires of our users. Most of these changes have occurred inside our buildings, from obtaining cutting-edge technology to providing self-service and redesigned spaces. While these changes have been vital, they've failed to increase our presence in the community. How can we truly demonstrate our value to our communities beyond our physical virtual space, programming, outreach, and materials? And I think that's really the question of embedded librarianship. How can we get out there and really demonstrate our value in ways that maybe we haven't thought of yet because we're so sort of internally focused? So one of the characteristics of embedded librarianship that I think is sometimes the most problematic is the fact that librarians in an embedded model are not interchangeable. I mean, in most libraries, especially in public services, librarians are pretty much interchangeable. You know, at the reference desk, if I am sick and I can't make my reference shift, one of my colleagues can do it. If I can't teach a class, someone can usually pop in and teach that class for me. There are contributions, you know, we might have a slightly different approach to doing things, but we can easily be, you know, placed in and out like widgets. Whereas with embedded librarianship, it's really focused on the individual librarian getting out into the community and building relationships with different community organizations, different people, different groups. And it's much more difficult then when you have these deep relationships with a community group, or in my case with an academic department, to just swap in another librarian who doesn't have those same relationships. But I think that's also what's so important, because you become the face of the library for that portion of your community. Embedded librarian projects, they're usually based on really deep understanding of the needs of your community. I think a lot of these programs are based on a lot of needs assessment work, a lot of getting out into the community and talking to community leaders, community activists, business leaders, to get a sense of what the needs are in the community and how the library can be more useful. Our service model for a long time in libraries was based on people coming to us. And really, embedded librarianship is about proactive support. It's about getting out of the library to provide support at patrons' points of need, to find where we can be useful beyond just physically being in the library. It's also really about being sort of immersed in the culture of our users, you know, being on committees in the community, being at community events, so that we're not just like the library, we are actually acting as a member of the community and contributing to that. And I think embedded librarianship is also really the hallmark of it is collaboration and building partnerships with other groups in our community rather than just being the library. And I think one of the most challenging things about this is that we're so attached to the models that we have had in libraries for so long, where we're at the desk and people come to us. I know at least in the United States, reference desk statistics have been declining rapidly. I know just in between 2016 and 2017, the Public Library Data Service Report showed a 10% decline in reference transactions in the US, and that was just in 1 year. I know, we're seen as these very trustworthy parts of our community, but people are less likely these days to think when they have an information need of asking a librarian. One interesting study in the US also found that 80% of questions brought to American public libraries were actually easily answerable by non-professional librarians. So, they didn't actually need a professional to be at the desk to answer those. The Douglas County Public Libraries in Colorado, who I'm going to be talking about more later, they actually tested that statistic themselves. They kept track, and they discovered that at their library, it was actually 85% of questions could be answered by a paraprofessional or a volunteer. Does it necessarily make sense to have highly trained reference librarians waiting at a desk that's a lot less busy when they're only needed to answer 15 to 20% of the questions asked? That is a question that every library needs to answer on their own. There are benefits to being a friendly and available face at the desk, but there's also a lot of other ways that our skills can be used, especially our expert research skills and just the ability to build relationships with our communities. So I started to first think about embedment when I read a blog post by Lorcan Dempsey of OCLC back in 2005. And he wrote this blog post called In the Flow, which talked about the need to find ways to get into our users' workflows. And I really became obsessed with the idea of that. And then when and I think I read it right around the time that I became a distance learning librarian, and I thought, our students use the learning management system basically as if it is their online campus. And we need to find ways that we can get in their flow instead of expecting them to leave that space and go visit the library's website for help. So I started to think about that, and then I saw this article later, the Embedded Librarian Program, which was the first article I'd ever read about embedded librarianship. And in this project, this was where a librarian actually embedded herself in discussion boards in an online classroom. So instead of just putting online resources in an online classroom, she was actually embedded there where students could ask questions. She could proactively, if she knew an assignment was coming up, provide information and help students that way and just be that much more available. And I was really inspired by that personally. So when my experiences with embedment have been pretty varied, and I want to go through this pretty quickly because I'd rather focus on more public library focused applications. But at every library I have worked at, I have worked with our online learning people to develop a library presence specifically within the LMS for online learners, so that instead of having to go elsewhere, they had a link that would take them to a research guide or a page that was tailored to either their course or their program that they could get to right from their online classroom. I've worked to embed library instruction into online courses. That is sometimes live instruction, just like this kind of thing, but also embedding content into the class where they don't even really see it necessarily as coming from the library, where it's just part of the content. I've done similar to that case study I mentioned. I've embedded myself into online courses through discussion boards. which can definitely be time consuming, as I am currently embedded in a class and suddenly last night got like 12 emails from students in that class. I've done a lot of relationship building in the liaison areas I have. I try to, go to, student orientations in my liaison areas, try to be involved in events. And we've also, at my current job, tried a personal librarian model in some of our courses where we tell students from the beginning, I am your librarian, I'm here to help you. And we follow up with some tailored instruction during the term, just so that they know that they can associate the library with a person instead of this like big, overwhelming, and sometimes intimidating place. So some of the transferable lessons that I've learned that I think are really relevant to public libraries as well is never underestimate the importance of consistent visibility. I never stop being amazed at the power of just like being there, being at meetings, being involved in things. The more people see somebody from the library, the more likely they are to think of the library at times when it's important to think of the library. So often I didn't have to do much more than like show up at a meeting to make sure the library was involved in an important initiative. One great example of that and how it didn't work well was the library was always involved in our new faculty orientation. We always came and provided some orientation to faculty, and we were involved on the committee that did that work. The one year, none of the librarians could make the time that they had their meetings. They suddenly got rid of the librarian portion, and we ended up not on the orientation, and we haven't been able to get back on since, even though we keep serving on the committee. So being there, being in the room where it happens is sometimes very, very important. Another thing that surprises me is what sometimes small things I do can lead to really important gains in our work with students and faculty and in our communities. Once I was working with a history faculty member, just talking to them about ordering some books they wanted in Chinese history. And they just started talking to me about the historical research methods course that they taught and how they were restructuring the class. And because of that conversation, I was able to work with them to integrate information literacy into the course through multiple librarian visits, through work with our archives. And it ended up being this amazingly rich collaboration that was really terrific for students as well. And you just never know when things like that are going to happen, when just being useful can be so helpful. Let's see. High touch work often doesn't scale up well. That's definitely an issue, unless you're really creative with how you scale up. Before you start, I think with any embedment project, it's worthwhile to think about like, what if we were tremendously successful? What if this was successful beyond our wildest dreams? What might it look like, and how might we deal with that? It's often useful to start with a pilot and dip your toe in, and I think most of the case studies I've read, that's usually what libraries have done, and when they haven't, it's usually been kind of problematic because high touch work is high touch. Having boundaries is very important. When I was embedded in online classes, students would email me on weekends. Students would email me, or they'd ask questions on the discussion board when I was on vacation. I was out of town. I was interviewing for other jobs. it didn't matter what was happening. They still expected that I was going to be able to respond to them at their convenience. So I've definitely made a point since my early work with embedment of making it clear that I'm not available 24/7, but they can get help from a librarian 24/7 through our chat service. They can go to a research help desk and get help, but I do have limited hours. Not being interchangeable can definitely be a problem. It's hard to swap somebody in to cover, an online discussion board that you're embedded in when they don't have access to the class. It's difficult when you're on a committee to sub a different librarian into that when they don't know the whole history and they don't have the relationships. And finally, I think, sometimes things are disasters and they don't go well and you learn from them and try again. I think a lot of embedment is like throwing spaghetti at a wall. Sometimes it works brilliantly, sometimes it doesn't. I find learning from the experience and being willing to take risks and continue trying things is really important. So getting started with embedment, the first thing that I think is valuable to do is do some research about your community. So scan your environment. That might mean doing a survey to look at community needs. But it also might mean just looking at documents and reports that were written by your city, your town, by other organizations in your community. There might be documents already out there and reports that you could look at. A lot of places, a lot of public libraries that have done this kind of work have gone out and interviewed people in the community. So, I think those people are sort of who are the movers and shakers in your community, like community leaders, people who are the heads of maybe social service organizations, local business organizations, chambers of commerce, small business organizations, that kind of stuff, community activists, prominent business people who are very active in the community, people in the local government, really get a sense of what the community needs are, what organizations maybe are sort of have similar goals to what the library has, or where the library can actually be useful to those organizations. All right, so obviously libraries could embed in so many different places in the community, so you kind of have to prioritize what you're actually going to work on and what groups you want to maybe embed with. And I think it's valuable. This is a chart from I think it's the Akron Summit County Public Library. When they were trying to do an embedded project, they looked at, what would provide high impact, and would provide high impact for the library, or that they could provide high impact to that group, and what would be really easy versus very difficult to get involved in. So in terms of thinking about impact, I'd suggest considering how in touch that group is with the community, what role you might play in the group, how in line their mission is with the libraries, and maybe also how your work with this group might benefit the library. In terms of easy versus hard, I think, looking at workload, if you're joining a committee, how difficult it might be to even get on that group. We can't do everything. You have to make choices about what groups to get involved in, but I think creating a chart like this can actually be really quite helpful. And I think a good way to get started is just to dip your toes in the water, do a pilot, maybe get involved in, one or two community groups, or partner with just a couple of groups. But embedment is not just going and giving a presentation on like, hi, we're the library and here's how we can help you. It's about really becoming a member of that group where you are contributing to their goals and are not only focused on the goals of the library. So this is from a quote from an article called Embedded Business Librarianship that was also in American Libraries. We'll demonstrate how the library is relevant by supporting our members, who in turn will support and understand the library on a deeper level. So that's the idea of being on groups like this, that you're not necessarily with the goal of getting people to use the library, but through being a member of that group, you can really demonstrate your value. So a lot of embedded librarians have worked to support local businesses. And I know some have done like really light embedment where they've just gone and, gone to a meeting and presented about resources, and that's certainly valuable. It's an easy, low touch thing that you can do. Go out to a local business networking group and tell them, oh, here's all these great resources that we have to support local businesses. If you're doing research for a business plan, we can help you with that. We do consultations. You can make an appointment with a librarian. You could also use those groups to get information from them about how the library could be more helpful to small and local business folks. You can offer trainings. You can also attend business-related events. Sometimes libraries set up booths at like career fairs and job seeker programs and provide and share the resources that they have available for job seekers or for growing businesses. But also you can become a member of those networking groups and prove your value through that kind of work. I know, I don't know if it's as big a trend in Australia as it is here in the US, but the gig economy is a very, very big thing here. Almost half of working millennials are freelancers. They are not at regular jobs. They are their own boss. And because we're in a freelance economy, we need co-working spaces, which are spaces where people can go to do their work, to have meetings that look more professional than being in their 9-year-old's bedroom. And there are co-working spaces that have all those resources so that you can look like a professional business even though you are a freelancer. Most of those spaces have community managers who libraries can liaise with. I know the Brooklyn Public Library has, they actually provided consultations in co-working spaces. They had a librarian who had a certain number of hours in co-working spaces, and then they did their assessment through surveys after each consultation to see whether it was valuable. And eventually they ended up building their own co-working space based on what they learned from being embedded in those spaces, so that they could support freelancers. Social service agencies are another great idea for getting involved. There are often outside advisory groups or boards for many social service agencies that folks can join, and having somebody, I find people love having librarians on groups like this because, one, librarians are usually really good at taking minutes, though I actually hate taking minutes, but everyone always thinks librarians are really good at taking minutes. But also, we do great research, and when a committee or group is looking to research a new topic, having an expert like a librarian on it is tremendously valuable. So being on boards or committees like that can be so, or advisory groups can be so valuable. We can provide research services. We can partner with social service agencies to serve folks in our libraries, because we know more and more public librarians are having to take on the role of social workers. Some libraries in the US even have hired social workers to work within their libraries. So I think the more that we partner with social service agencies, the more effectively we can serve our patrons and help them serve their service population. So I feel like embedment can kind of go both ways with social service agencies. And in the end, we'll get a much better sense of what our communities need from this kind of embedment. I think partnering with local technology groups in the community is kind of a no-brainer, and a lot of libraries in the US have been doing that to create maker spaces, to develop programming. For the most part, they're bringing the tech groups into the library, but there's no reason we can't also get involved with those technology groups to get a better sense of what unmet needs are in our communities. Schools, public schools are an area that I struggle with in the US. We have seen our school librarian populations just gutted in so many school districts. I was recently looking at the statistics of school librarians in Oregon, and it was absolutely appalling to see how many there were in the 1980s versus now. It was just appalling. So, there's this philosophy like, well, we shouldn't fill the gap because we're providing a service that should be provided by a credentialed librarian. But at the same time, as a college librarian, I see so many students coming into college with negligible information literacy skills. And so seeing how we can support schools that don't have librarians to provide information literacy instruction and sort of fill some of those gaps does seem really important to the greater good. We can join school advisory groups. We can also support teachers by providing instruction to them, sort of a train the trainer, show them the resources we have available, maybe also teach instructors about information literacy, show them resources. I know we've created research guides for some high school classes that have come into the library. We've created research guides to support the students when they are doing their research papers out at their high schools. And I saw one library even offered a book club for kids and teens that was physically at the school rather than asking them to come to the library. They offered it as like an after-school activity, which I thought was really quite nice. Community reference is something I think that libraries have been doing for quite some time. I'm thinking more like librarians being at community events. I know my local public library is often at our farmers market, spreading the word about their resources. They could be at celebrations, town hall meetings. You could, if there's a big issue that's being discussed in the community, you could provide relevant evidence-based materials at the events to support people's understanding of those issues. I think that's really quite valuable. And to me, the big benefit of all of this work is, the relationship building is important. Getting people to see the value of what we do is important, but we learn so much by being embedded in the community about what our populations need. And I think that we can then bring back to the library to benefit, to change our services to better meet the needs of our communities. So assessment is something that is too often ignored when we get started with a project like this. People then they try something and then afterwards they think, oh, was this worth it? We've taken time away from the reference desk, hours from the reference desk to do this work. Is it worthwhile? And I think it's really important to, before you start, really figure out what success would look like, what benchmarks you hope to reach with the project. And think about the opportunity costs, because when you're doing something new, you have to give something up. We only have a certain number of hours in the day. So think about what you're giving up to do this, and are the benefits worth the costs? Because I know I've seen case studies in academia where librarians have embedded, they've provided reference across campus and other places, and have had very few questions in those spaces when they could have, been at the library when they're not providing the service at the library where students actually expect it. So it's important to think about the benefits versus the costs. I often think we focus a lot on numbers, and it's really important to also collect stories from our stakeholders and think about the impact on our community that goes beyond just numerical value. Did people who use this service, were they more likely to come into the library? How do you get those stories? It's much more difficult to figure out, but I think it's possible if you're doing good assessment work. And I think a lot of this work it takes a long time for this relationship building to bear fruit sometimes. So it can be hard to really know whether you're successful in a short period of time. So I'm going to show you a couple of case studies from public libraries that have really embraced embedment in the US. The first one is the Deschutes Public Library in my home state of Oregon. So the director, they had a new director start some years ago. I can't remember how many years ago, but he immediately wanted to do focus groups to get a sense of what the community thought about the library. And he found that people really valued the library, but he said, quote, they felt guilty about not knowing much about their library. So they thought, oh, it's so great that we have a library, but we don't really use it that much or know what they offer. So he really wanted to get the reference librarians out into the community, and he rebranded them. All of the librarians, instead of being called reference librarians, they are actually called community librarians. They go out to civic organizations in their county, and they have librarians who are members of more than 60 different organizations. They're a pretty large public library, so that works for them. Obviously, 60 is quite a large number for a very small public library, but I think it's wonderful having librarians be members of that many organizations. I can only imagine how much useful information they gain about the community. The Douglas County Library System was really, and they're in Colorado, they were really an inspiration for a lot of libraries getting involved in sort of this community reference push and in doing embedment. And they started by just by interviewing community leaders. Their director, he's a really sort of visionary guy. He's now he now works at the American Library Association. He's the head of the Office of Intellectual Freedom. But at the time, he was a director with a vision of just having librarians more embedded in the community. And he asked them to just go out and interview community leaders. So they would go out in pairs and say, hi, I'm from the library. I'm here to learn more about your organization and how the library can support you and your goals. And they just asked those 3 questions. What are the key issues facing your stakeholders? What do you wish you knew? And who else should we speak to? And from there, they started to develop an idea of what community reference would look like. And they started really small. They started by just, I think they asked librarians to attend like one meeting per month. Like that was all they asked them to do from the beginning. But so the librarians would choose like city council, their metro district, economic development councils, the school advisory boards. They were even at a local women's crisis center. And they just attended meetings and were members of these and became members of these groups. And they ended up providing some really valuable expert research. I know at the time, Colorado had recently legalized recreational marijuana, and they did a bunch of research for their county that informed how they, I think it was how they zoned. I think it was about how they zoned the marijuana businesses or something, but they provided some really valuable research that the folks doing that work in the county didn't have time to do. So instead of, demonstrating our value by saying, hey, the library's great, we have all these things, we're demonstrating it really through our actions and through being parts of these groups. So I thought that was just amazing. And here's a quote from a manager at the Douglas County Library. What we expect of our librarians is simply that they show up and pay attention. By becoming aware of the issues important to the community group they're embedded in, they can begin to find ways to become part of what that group is working on. And I'm sure there are many occasions in which they don't really have as big a role as they did on that group that was studying marijuana businesses. But I think that's, there's still value to being on a committee even when they are not providing expert research. I really liked with Douglas County how systematic they are about collecting the information they're learning. They track everything on a blog where the librarians share information on community leaders. They share meeting minutes and activities. So that's all in a central repository. Because I could imagine, and this is one of the problems with embedded librarianship, is that people can really get, the information can get really siloed because you have that relationship and this person deeply knows what's happening in this organization. But by making sure that they share that information, then everyone is aware of what's happening and can use that information to enrich the library. All right, so some important considerations, and I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because I want to leave time for questions. So for the embedded librarian, as I said before, this is a long-term project that requires being present, and sometimes it can feel like just being there and sitting there and maybe occasionally contributing is not useful. It's not a good use of our time. It's really going to depend on the organization whether it is or not, but those kind of relationships, you just never know when they're going to bear fruit. You never know what meeting is going to happen where you can interject something and become a really critical part of a project in your community. You just never know. Embedment requires outgoingness and relationship building, and that's not always something that is really comfortable for librarians. I mean, as an introvert, this is not something that is particularly in my wheelhouse, but I do it. I make myself do it. And because I know that it's really valuable. I know, I would rather be at home than go to, academic events and hang out with other faculty. But I know those are the opportunities that, I know whenever I do have those experiences, I end up doing a new collaboration or something. It's those informal opportunities to talk with faculty that end up being so fruitful. it's important not to make this about the library's agenda. You know, you're there to further the goals of the people that you're working with. And you can't really make it about the library. And I think academic librarians, at least, we get really stuck on that, like, oh, you know, our agenda, we really want to embed information literacy into the curriculum. We want to do library instruction. Maybe what we want isn't always a good fit for the curriculum. Maybe, you know, we need to do a lot more listening and seeing how we can be useful rather than being focused on our own agenda. Some of this work might involve shifting hours. A lot of meetings are going to be held in the evenings, so this might provide some challenges for some librarians in some places of work. The workload can be very big with embedded projects, and it's important for librarians not to be martyrs and to be aware of their own limitations. I think we librarians sometimes, you know, our workload grows and grows and we don't say anything. We just keep, you know, trying to make it work, but we need to talk to our managers if it becomes too big. And boundaries, yes, boundaries are so important. I feel like embedment is a really radical change in how libraries are situated in our communities. And I think there are a lot of people who are very comfortable with the current models of providing services and being available, you know, for people who come into the library. I think there's, you know, I think at a lot of places there is going to be resistance. And I also don't think most places should just like say, okay, we are not providing reference services at the research help desk anymore. We are going to be out in the community instead of in the library all the time. Like that's not the goal here. I think, you know, you try a pilot, you get your feet wet, you see what is sustainable and what really makes sense for your community. But this work takes time and it's important. I think one of a manager's most important roles is protecting their employees' time and making sure they aren't overworked. As I said before, staffing can be problematic when we're not as interchangeable. Scalability is obviously huge. Let's see. Oh, yes. And as I said before, develop an assessment plan before you start so you're not left scrambling to think, well, is this valuable? I don't really know. Think about how you're going to measure that before you get started. And I think, you know, as I said before, a balance has to be found between being outwardly engaged and being engaged internally with the library. We can't just say we're going to do one or the other. There was a great article by Watstein and Kesselman called Creating Opportunities Embedded Librarians. It looked at organizational structures that support embedded librarianship. And they argued that most traditional organizations really aren't structured well to support this. And I know at Douglas County, they moved to team-based structures, which is what was mentioned in this article. They said team-based structures really work well for this kind of work. Librarians need to have more autonomy. They need to feel empowered to try things and take risks. And the organization needs to really be responsive because this is work that requires a lot of changes in what we're doing. And as I said before, the results of this work are often very uneven. Some things will bear fruit quickly, some won't. Some it will be slow, incremental work, and when you least expect it, you're going to get an opportunity to be very involved in a very important project in your community, and you just never know when that's going to happen. So I would love to see what questions you have that I can answer now. I don't know if there are any in the chat. Sorry, I'm not hearing anything. Is anyone talking?
It's
Yay.
different screen from the house.
Thank you very much for that, Meredith. That was really good to sort of think more about the strategy behind why we might get involved in community groups. I know that so many library services actually already do this sort of thing. You know, we become part of these groups having a particular project meeting, so we become part of that. But we don't necessarily think about that future strategy behind that and towards getting it more about keeping us in that space rather than, oh, the library's part of, you know, just that meeting because it's the right thing to do.
Giving it a name and a definition, I think is really useful too. Be able to say, well, this is an embedded librarian project and we're doing it because of these reasons. It actually mentions
Yeah, I think I just thought just saying we're going to do an embedded project. Yeah, that can be problematic because, yeah, what does that look like?
Can't hear your speakers.
Hello?
I'm just wondering if one of our Blue Jeans people is actually asking a question with their microphone.
Yep. Yep.
Can you start,
Hi.
Yes, and then absolutely when you really need it, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, everybody.
Is there a question? I think I might have. I'm just hearing sort of burbling.
So does anybody else in chat have questions for Meredith?
Which one?
Anyone else, do you have questions?
Does anyone else in the room? Yeah, right?
I had a class for I never class in my own and went to get
Okay, can you just click on participant? So we've got someone who's in the group who seems to be asking a question using the microphone. We can't actually hear you. So we can't, can we go further down the list? We can't hear what it is that you're saying if you're asking a question.
Please put it through chat.
Really need to use chat.
Yeah,
Can't
it
stress that.
sounds like the verbal equivalent of a bubbling brook or something for me.
Yeah.
It's like you're underwater and it's like, no, this is just so wasn't happening. Okay.
I'm glad it wasn't just me. Am I
Yeah.
supposed to be answering something?
No, not yet. So, does anybody have any questions about doing that? In terms of the long-term focus, so when you think about these things as having a long-term goal, and you really have to think into the future before you really start to see some of these returns.
Right.
How long is that taking for you? You know, is this like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, or are we talking 20, 50 years down the track?
Well, I've been in the profession that long, but I mean, when I think about relationship building in my liaison areas, I mean, obviously I don't work in a public library, but when I work with faculty in my liaison areas, there are some groups with which, I was immediately welcomed and people wanted to work with me and collaborate with me on classes and saw me as a partner. And there were others where, I was constantly, pushing my friendly, helpful presence and, not getting anywhere for years and years. And I remember in my first job, it was 6 years when I was just about to leave for another job. And the psychology department that I'd worked with for 6 years, they were like, "Oh, we really want to work with you to map where information literacy can be taught and assessed in our curriculum." Like suddenly it was so important to them, and they'd never, had any interest in working with me on anything before. So you never know. Like I just think that by being a persistent in the nicest and least obnoxious way and helpful presence over time leads to valuable collaborations, and you just never know when those things are going to happen. Sometimes very fast, sometimes, hopefully not 20 or 50 years.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions, Ellen?
I think that was absolutely fabulous, and it's made me think about various connections here and I think Catherine's comment about having a term for it can be helpful as well. And I think it's always a good reminder to get people thinking about their assessment or their evaluation at the start of the project rather than looking at it later on, because otherwise how do you know that you're successful? And some things do take longer. But I think it also is how can people think about leveraging their existing contacts so that it becomes a little bit more embedded. So the being invited to talk at something, how does that lead to a longer term relationship? And that's going to be different for each organisation. So it's certainly given me a lot to go away and think about too.
But
Oh,
you
that's
can,
great.
what I'm thinking is that you can create a living document where you can bring together all those embedded librarian situations that you may already have with your stakeholders and various groups, pull it all together, put the outcomes and the objectives and just record. It could be a blog, or it could be just a living document that gets added to on a regular basis, so that you've got something that you can track the progress and that you can then report on it.
Yeah.
I really like that idea.
Yeah.
Because you're already doing a lot of it.
Yeah.
You just don't realise that now there's a term that we've got to hang it on,
Right.
that we can go to our leaders and our committees and our councils and say, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and this is what happens because we're doing it.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Yeah. The idea that librarians have not been out in their communities doing things is definitely not realistic. I think most libraries have strong connections already.
Yeah, I think some of the things that I've, just noted down myself is that, yes, within my library service, we are doing these sorts of things, but we're doing them out of hours. We're doing them in our own personal hours. We aren't actually factoring them into the working day and moving our working hours to compensate for those. And that maybe we should start looking at that a little bit more closely, because I look at some of the work that a couple of staff in particular do, and it's kind of like we should be supporting that a bit more than what we're doing, instead of asking them to do that in their own time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think operationalizing this across the organization, and also that shows respect for the librarians' initiative and their labor.
And it's included in their job description.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, job descriptions with embedded librarianship in it would be really good. And I suppose that's actually a question for you, Meredith. So in terms of your role at the moment, does your position description include that definition of embedded librarianship, or is it just inferred?
Information literacy. Yeah, it's a very generic reference and instruction librarian description, which in some ways is nice because we can define our jobs in different ways. Like I have a colleague who's very invested in user experience work, and that's where her heart lies. And I'm very obviously interested in embedment and outreach to online courses, and that's what I do. So yeah, there are nice things about flexibility, but at the same time, I struggle with the fact that anything I do is, I can't get operationalized to the whole library because I don't have the authority for that to say, like, we are going to embed in courses because we think this is valuable. We're going to be personal librarians. I don't have the authority to do that. I have to sort of sell my colleagues on it one by one.
Cool. So, any other questions from the room? Any other questions from online? No? Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Meredith, for your time this morning. It's been really fabulous having you come all the way from your 9-year-old's bedroom and share your embedded librarianship experience with us. So, thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you.
Take care.